Welcome, everyone, to the last planned IITE seminar of the year. And this time it is my great pleasure to welcome Ágnes Móréh, who's coming from Hungary, from the Center of Ecological Research in Budapest. And we are going to be learning something about what happens when it's not just one, but multiple simultaneous species that are invading an ecosystem. So without further ado, Ági, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Yuri, and thank you, everyone, to come and listen to me today. Thanks for inviting me and for the opportunity to share some of our first results and ideas about the modeling of two-species invasion. Just a few words about myself and how this topic came about at all. For several years, I've been working on modeling the dynamics of food webs. And within this broad area, I have explored different ecological questions. For example, how overfishing can trigger regime shifts in communities, or how disturbances in general affect species depending on their position in the network. And in one of our previous studies, we looked at what happens when two species are disturbed at the same time. Specifically, we asked whether the additive or non-additive nature of these disturbance effects is related to the network positions of the affected species. And that work was what actually inspired the present study. We thought, what if we ask a similar question, but in the context of invasive species? This topic, of course, not new, especially since the classic paper by Simberloff and von Holle from 1999 about the positive interactions of non-indigenous species. In that study, they argued that introduced species can actually facilitate each other's establishment and spread, potentially accelerating the wall invasion process. And they termed this phenomenon as invasional meltdown. And when I started digging deeper into the literature, I found it quite interesting that although multi-species invasions have become a very active research field, the purely theoretical or mathematical modeling studies in this context are still surprisingly rare. Theoretical work has mostly focused on single-species invasions, examining, for example, the traits that determine invasion success, or how a single invader affects resident communities. But when it comes to two or more invaders, the field is still dominated by field studies, mesocosm experiments, and meta-analysis built from draws. And first, let me show some conclusions from those syntheses. The study by Jackson was among the first global meta-analysis on interactions among invasive animals, and it showed that, on average, invaders tend to hinder rather than help each other. The mean interaction effect was either neutral or dampening, but not amplifying. In other words, invasional meltdown doesn't seem to be a general rule, at least among animals. Likewise, Cameron and his collaborators in another meta-analysis, they analyzed more than 700 studies on terrestrial invertebrate invasions. And then they found that invaders have strong and consistent negative impacts on native species and ecosystem processes, but multiple invaders didn't produce stronger effects than single invaders. So overall, both meta-analyses suggest that positive interactions among invaders are not universal, and their combined impacts are strongly community and context dependent. To illustrate what I mean by that, here are two examples from the empirical literature. In the first one, the two invasive species, a crayfish and a snail, were examined in experimental ponds. It was found that both species negatively affected native snails, and that their combined presence caused stronger community impacts than either species alone. So even without strong positive interactions between the invaders, the overall ecological impact was amplified. In the second example, the authors explicitly tested the invasional meltdown hypothesis, and they developed the framework to distinguish additives, the synergistic and antagonistic effects, and tested it experimentally using 3 invasive species. Interestingly, they found additive rather than synergistic effects, no evidence for a true meltdown. Together, these studies show that the outcomes of multi-species invasions can be both complex and highly variable. And the outcomes strongly depends on the questions and the communities investigated communities in question. And this highlights an important point. While empirical work has advanced substantially, we still lack theoretical models that can explain why and when these different outcomes can emerge. But let me briefly show 2 examples. In the first study, the authors used a spatially explicit competition model to simulate the joint invasion of 2 thistle species. And the results show that when interspecific competition is strong, then a spatial segregation and reduced spread can emerge. They refer to this outcome as invasional interference. In contrast, coexistence or moving invasion fronts can arise when competitive asymmetry is weaker between the invaders. And in the second study, the authors applied an allometric niche approach to infer the trophic roles of the two invaders in a French lake. And they want to predict how their co-occurrence alters food web structure and energy flow. And this model indicated mostly additive impacts, with both species competing for similar resources and increasing the trophic vulnerability of the resident taxa. It is important that this model was, they used this model for investigating a real, well-described community. And these examples illustrate the possibilities of modeling to explore different mechanisms of multi-species invasion, from direct competition to indirect food web-mediated interactions, and to anticipate possible outcomes when empirical data are still limited. So far, I have shown examples and general findings from empirical and experimental studies, but now I would like to turn to our own work, which focuses on exploring these interactions through a modeling approach. Let me first give you a quick overview of how our study was set up and what we wanted to find out. We explored 2 invasion scenarios. First, we introduced each invasive species separately into a pre-established resident community. Then we introduced both of them together into the same network. And alongside the simulations, we performed the network analysis to identify the position of each invader within the community and to assess whether any direct or indirect links formed between them. And finally, we compared the invasion success across the 2 scenarios and examined whether the joint invasion produced additive or non-additive effects on the resident community. Next, I would like to walk you through the main questions we asked. The first one was, does the presence of another invasive species influence an invader's success? In other words, if a species is unsuccessful or successful when invading alone, can it maintain that same outcome when another invader is introduced at the same time? And what are the possible outcomes of such interactions? To answer this, we first need a clear definition of what we mean by success. This is important both in general invasion ecology and in the specific context of our simulations. The invasion process can be broken into several stages, and the exact terminology depends on whether we are dealing with aquatic or terrestrial systems, plants or animals. I won't go into those details here, but virtually all frameworks include four core steps: the translocation from the invader's original habitat, the introduction into the new habitat, the establishment, and the spreading phase. And in our study, we considered an invasion successful if the invader completed the last two steps, meaning it established and maintained a viable reproducing population in the resident community. And in the simulations, we operationalized this definition quite simply. We classified an invader as successful if at equilibrium it persisted in the community with a positive biomass. On this slide, you can see the possible outcomes in terms of presence or absence. If you don't distinguish between the two invaders, meaning their order doesn't matter, there are 10 possible outputs. In the figure, green boxes indicate successful and red boxes indicate unsuccessful invaders. And the color gradient means that one species persists while the other goes extinct. And the top row shows the case where both are successful in both scenarios when introduced alone and together. And the second row, the joint invasion leads to the extinction of one of the invaders, and so on. We can move through all the possible combinations down to the final case where none of them can establish in the system, neither individually nor together. Invasion success can be evaluated in other ways than simply looking at presence or absence. If both invaders are present in both scenarios, it allows us to compare their equilibrium biomass between the two cases. By doing so, we can assess whether the presence of a second invader enhances or suppresses the success of the first. Next, I would like to turn to the joint impact of the two invaders on the resident community. We distinguish three well-known general types of combined effects. If their impacts simply add up, we call this an additive effect. And if the combined impact is weaker or stronger than expected from their individual effects, it is antagonistic or synergistic, respectively. I should also note that here, similar to our biomass analysis, we only consider the always successful case, this first one, so that we can meaningfully evaluate their joint impact. And finally, it is an important note that when assessing additivity, we must use properties that are clearly measurable and quantifiable. Since we were working with simulated networks, not real ones, we focused on two completely general but well measurable outcomes. The first metric we looked at was the number of resident species that go extinct as a consequence of the invasion. If any extinctions occur at all, and the community doesn't remain entirely intact. Instead of simply adding up the number of extinctions caused by each invader separately, we use the more nuanced approach. It can be that the two invaders eliminate partly or even completely the same set of resident species. And to account for this possible overlap, we compare the common effect not to the simple sum of the individual extinctions, but to the size of the union of the extinction sets caused by the two invaders. And this prevents us from incorrectly labeling cases as antagonistic, where the combined effect appears smaller than the sum, merely because both invaders target the same resident species. And the second property we compared between the two scenarios was the total biomass of the resident community, excluding the invaders themselves. There are many ways to formalize community responses in terms of biomass change, depending, for example, on whether we consider the direction of change or not. This represents fundamentally different approaches. Here, in our case, we focused on the net change in total resident biomass, where both directions is possible. The community's biomass may either decrease or increase. The three previously mentioned main categories of additivity naturally arise once we compare the joint impact to the sum of the separate effects. In this context, a fourth category can also appear, which is actually a special case of antagonism. The joint effect is not only smaller than the sum of individual effects, but actually of reverse direction. This reversal is straightforward in cases where both individual effects point in the same direction, like here and here. But when the two separate effects differ in sign, we consider the joint effect reversed only if it goes against the direction of the effect with the larger absolute magnitude. Let me already note that this category occurs relatively rarely. The third, and in many ways the most important set of questions, concerns the factors that shape the possible outcomes of two species invasions. We asked how these outputs are influenced by the direct or indirect interactions that may arise between the two invaders, such as direct trophic links, trophic cascades, or the different forms of competition, or whether the two species enter the resident network at distant positions. We also examined how the network position of the invaders themselves affect the results, both in terms of their trophic level and whether they function as a top or an intermediate consumers within the network. In the following, I would like to say a few words about the modeling framework we used. Our simulations are based on the bioenergetic model, which connects metabolism and trophic interactions directly to body size. Because body size strongly affects feeding rates, trophic position, and the stability of predator-prey interactions, it becomes a fundamental predictor of food web dynamics. And this allometric framework is what allows us to simulate invasion scenarios in a mechanistic, biologically grounded way. And it was extended by Brose and his colleagues to make it applicable to large, complex food webs. And our simulations use their version in all technical details. Just in a nutshell, the model incorporates a Holling type functional response exploiting its nonlinear stabilizing effect on consumer resource dynamics. And as I noted earlier, the reproduction, the metabolism, and the consumption as well scale with body mass following an allometric power law. And the dimensionless ratios, such as the mass-specific metabolic rate and the consumption rate, are encoded the predator-prey body size relationships. In this way, the body size directly shapes the interaction strengths and ultimately the stability of the system. And an important advantage of this modeling framework is that the allometric constants we use come from empirical measurements. And this means that the key physiological rates can be fixed at biologically plausible values beforehand, greatly reducing the dimensionality of the parameter space. In our model, this means that the only parameter that effectively varies across species is their metabolic rate, which is fully determined by the body mass ratio between the consumers and the basal species. Assuming a constant body mass ratio between each consumer and its resource, the body mass of each species can be derived directly from its trophic level by using this formula. And this immediately determines its mass-specific metabolic rate through the allometric scaling relations. In this way, the trophic structure of the community not only defines who interacts with whom, but also constrains the dynamical rates of all species. And just a quick technical note here, we worked with 110 resident networks, each containing between 10 and 20 species. Once each resident community settled into its equilibrium, we systematically introduced the invasive species across different trophic levels, and then simply let the system run until it reached a new equilibrium. Altogether, this gave us more than 100,000 invasion events we investigated. So now let's move on to the results. First, we looked at how frequently the 10 possible presence-absence outcomes actually occurred. And what immediately stands out is that 5 of them are clearly the dominant outcomes, while the other 5 are so rare that we excluded them from further analysis. Just a short remark, sometimes we just don't get the thing we are most curious about. I was really sorry to exclude these much more interesting cases, but we decided that we continue their investigation in the close future. Among the outcomes we examined, one clearly stands out, the case where both invaders succeed alone and together, this first one. This high success rate is likely due to the strong inherent stability of the resident networks, something that comes from the model setup we use, and this stability isn't substantially disrupted even by one or two newly introduced species. But this particular outcome is especially useful for us because it allows a direct comparison of the invaders' equilibrium biomasses between the two scenarios. In other words, we can finally ask whether the invaders' biomass increases or decreases in the presence of the other species compared to when it invades alone. What we find is that in about half of the cases, one invader increases in biomass while the other one decreases. But we also see situations where both species negatively affect each other, and conversely, cases where they actually perform better together and each reaches a higher equilibrium biomass than in isolation. Focusing again the outcome where both invaders are always successful gives us also a basis to compare their impact on the resident community. As I mentioned earlier, we assessed these impacts in two ways. First, by looking at how many resident species go extinct, and second, by measuring the net change in total resident biomass. And without going now into all the details, when we look at diversity loss, one important result is that the community remains completely intact in about 1/3 of all cases. It is likely due to the strong stability built into these networks. And when extinctions occur, the joint effect of the two invaders is most often additive. In case of biomass change, it is observed in every invasion event. So here we can always classify the outcome as additive or non-additive. And from this perspective, the overwhelming majority of outcomes turn to be antagonistic. So far, I have been talking about how often the different outcomes appear in the full dataset. But our main question is whether these frequencies are influenced by factors such as the presence of direct or indirect interactions between the two invaders, and if so, to what extent. I won't go into the statistical details here, but one thing that's important to highlight is that because of the large sample size, we ended up with statistically significant results pretty much everywhere. That's why the effect sizes of the statistical tests are much more informative for us than the p-values themselves. We used the proper effect sizes to quantify how strongly each type of interaction shifts the distribution of outcomes compared to what we see in the full dataset. We indicated the magnitude of the effect size with the plus signs above each bar here and here. And even though these different types of interactions don't produce very strong overall effects, we can still see some clear patterns. Certain interaction types tend to shift the probabilities of specific outcomes, making some of them more likely and others less likely. So while the overall impact is modest, there are consistent trends. One thing that is definitely worth to point out is what happens where there is a direct trophic link between the two invaders, meaning one actually consumes the other. In those cases, we can see that the probability that both invaders always succeed actually increases. On the other hand, if one of them would normally fail when invading alone, it becomes more likely to survive when the other invader is present. This here. But at the same time, there is also a downside. The closer and more direct the interaction between the two invaders, the more likely it is that their equilibrium biomass drops when they invade together. So direct trophic relationships can stabilize their presence, but often at the cost of reduced biomass for both. So now let's take a closer look at the effects of direct and indirect interactions separately. As we already saw, when one invader feeds on the other, that increases the chance of both of them will succeed when they invade together. And this effect becomes even stronger when this interaction is combined with any form of competition, when they share a prey or a predator or both. But there is an important flip side here. Intraguild predation also makes it more likely that the two invaders, which are individually unsuccessful, will also fail together. And if you look at the biomass changes, this pattern becomes even clearer. The intraguild predation strongly increases the likelihood that both invaders negatively affect each other, meaning that both end up with lower biomass than they would have if they had invaded alone. And what's striking is that even having a shared predator doesn't counteract this negative effect. Now, if we turn to the indirect interactions, the one that really matters for success or failure is the exploitative competition. This increases the frequency of the both unsuccessful outcome, and it also raises the chance that two invaders, which are individually successful, will end up with one of them going extinct when they invade together. And looking again at the invaders' biomass changes, the exploitative competition clearly pushes both species toward lower biomass. But interestingly, having a shared predator, that is the apparent competition, it's not only counterbalances this negative impact, it actually increases the likelihood that both invaders experience biomass increase when they co-occur. Now let's look at whether the combined impact of the two invaders on the resident community depends on the type of interaction that forms between them. Overall, the effect is quite small, whether we look at the loss of diversity or the net change in community biomass. The interaction type between the invaders doesn't explain much of the variation. But there are some clear patterns worth to point out. When a direct predator-prey relationship emerges between the two invaders during co-invasion, the likelihood of an antagonistic combined effect increases, and at the expense of synergistic outcomes. In contrast, the further apart the two invaders are in the food web topology, especially when we consider the net biomass change, the more likely they are to produce synergistic, mutually reinforcing effect on the community. But I repeat that these effects are very weak. Beyond the general effect that predator-prey interactions tend to increase the frequency of antagonistic outcomes, this effect becomes even stronger when this is paired with competition for a shared prey. When the two invaders are in an intragate predation relationship. And among the indirect interactions, the apparent competition stands out. And when we look at biomass change, so does the trophic cascade. Both of these increase the likelihood of synergistic effects, both on their own and when they occur in combination. I would also add that, as I mentioned earlier, the antagonistic subcase, the so-called reversed effect, is rare overall, and its probability doesn't meaningfully increase or decrease under any of the interaction types. Looking at the positions of the invaders in the food webs, one of the things we checked was whether they show up as top or intermediate consumers. But we also took into account whether a predator-prey in relationship forms between them or not. When we look at their invasion success, we can see that if one invader feeds on the other, the probability that both succeed is higher, and this holds regardless of whether they are top or intermediate consumers. What's also striking, though, is that when both species enter as a top predator, the likelihood that at least one of them fails increases a lot. If we look at the direction of their biomass change, the pattern becomes very clear. It's not their trophic position that drives the differences, but simply whether a direct predator-prey links exists between them. And in cases where this happens, it is not surprising that they reduce each other's biomass more strongly as top predators than as in intermediate position. The other way we looked at the role of position was by asking at what trophic level the invaders entered the network. From earlier single invader studies, we already know that trophic level has a strong effect on invasion success, and we see exactly the same pattern here. Whenever one of the invaders fails during a simultaneous invasion, the failed species tends to enter at significantly higher trophic level than those that successfully establish. But interestingly, when we look at success from the perspective of the direction of biomass change, this difference disappears. This is simply because of the implementation of our invasion into the model. The species labeled 1 always enters at a lower trophic level than the second, regardless of whether its biomass ends up increasing or decreasing. And turning to the impact on the resident community, the pattern is very clear. The lower the trophic level at which the invasion happens, the more likely it is that at least one resident species goes extinct. And for the total resident biomass, invaders generally have a negative effect both at low and at high trophic levels, but at intermediate trophic levels, the opposite can happen. The probability that the invader actually increases the total biomass becomes much higher. So on this slide, we are looking at how the frequency of the different invasion outcomes shifts in percentage terms relative to what we see in the full dataset when we plot it against the trophic levels of the two invaders. As I mentioned earlier, trophic level has a clear trend with invasion success. The lower the trophic level at which a species enters, the more likely it is to establish successfully. And that's, of course, true both separately and when another invader is present. But the outcome of the joint invasion also depends on how similar or how different the two invaders' trophic levels are. The larger the difference between their trophic levels, the more it shapes the overall pattern of outcomes. If we look at changes in the invader biomass instead of simple success or failure, the patterns are less sharply separated, but still invaders entering at lower trophic levels are generally more likely to experience a decrease in biomass, while at higher trophic levels, biomass tends to drop only when the difference between the two trophic levels is small. Now, if we look at how the different additivity categories change in frequency, focusing first on species loss, we see patterns that are very much in line with what I have already shown you. First, the higher the trophic level at which the invaders enter, the more likely it is that the resident food web remains completely intact. And second, the non-additive outcomes become more common at lower trophic levels. And third, the additive effects become more frequent when the difference between the invaders' trophic levels is larger. The same story. Invaders entering at higher trophic levels tend to produce more additive effects because the resident network is more likely to remain intact. We also see a similar pattern for the synergistic effects. These also become more likely when invaders enter at higher trophic levels. And finally, the reversed effect, oops, it is a mistake here. It is the reverse effect. That's a special case of antagonism, is rare overall, but when it does happen, it tends to occur when the invaders enter at intermediate trophic levels. There is one important point we shouldn't ignore. When we combine the effects of trophic level with the direct or indirect interactions that can form between the invaders, the picture becomes more nuanced. And the reason is simple. There is a strong link between the trophic positions of the invaders and the types of interaction. And depending on which trophic levels the two species enter at, some interaction types become very likely, while others become much less likely or even impossible. So this also means that we can't really treat trophic level and interaction type as independent factors. The two are inherently connected, and they are best understood when we analyze them together. And let me illustrate this with two specific outcome types. The first one is when both invaders succeed alone, but when they arrive together, one of them fails to establish. And the second is the opposite. One invader would fail alone, but in the presence of the other, it actually manages to persist. And if we go back to the previous figure, you can see that when we ignore the specific interaction between them and look only when the two invaders enter at more different trophic levels. But once we take into account the type of interaction, the main types of interactions, that forms the For example, when a predator-prey relationship develops between them, the probability of this outcome, where the otherwise unsuccessful invader is rescued by the other, it increases dramatically. In contrast, the exploitative competition shifts the pattern in the opposite direction. It greatly increases the likelihood of the first outcome, where two invaders that would both succeed on their own end up with one of them going extinct when they that besides the trophic level, the nature of the interaction between the invaders can play an equally important or sometimes even stronger role in shaping the outcome. So let me give a short summary. Overall, the most common outcome we found was that both invasive species were successful, both on their own and when introduced together. This is partly because the model generates a highly stable community structure, and the interactions between the invader species tend to remain relatively weak, considering their invasion success. But even with weak interactions, the invaders still have a measurable impact. In most cases, they reduce each other's biomass, so the effect is definitely there. Another important message here is that the metric we use to describe the community impact really matters. Species richness may stay completely unchanged, while biomass almost always shifts. These results are broadly consistent with findings from meta-analyses, which also report additive and antagonistic outcomes as the most common. At the same time, because many factors interact simultaneously, the predictive power remains very limited. And this is exactly why different case studies often show contrasting patterns. The allometric modeling framework we used has, of course, not only strengths but also limitations. One advantage is that it produces a very stable food web, which makes it suitable for comparative analysis. The allometric relationships also reduce the number of free parameters, which is helpful. However, the model is most appropriate for aquatic, mainly for marine food webs, where body size is a reliable predictor of interactions. But in terrestrial systems, this relationship is much weaker and the model becomes less applicable. It also ignores important factors like behavioral differences and seasonal dynamics. When it comes to invasion outcomes, the trophic position clearly plays a central role, but it is not the single relevant trait. Other species-level properties and community characteristics may also be necessary to consider, especially since communities can respond in several different ways. All in all, the effects of multiple simultaneous invasions depend on the balance between how the invaders interact with each other and how they interact with the resident community. Finally, I would like to thank my supervisor and collaborator István Scheuring, as well as Ferenc Jordan, for their guidance and the work we have done together. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank
And I
you
am
very
ready
much,
for
Agi.
questions.
Yes, we will open the floor for questions. Thank you. First thing I was wondering of it, this is just to check. I'm right that we're looking at the long-term effect of invasion. So the invaders invade and then they actually get time to establish or die.
Yes,
Yes. And
yes,
in
of
that
course.
case, is there a difference between this versus sequential invasion? So is the fact that the invasion is simultaneous, does that
Yes, it is very good question and an interesting question that how time matters. This investigation, this study is about the transient phase. So it is simultaneous means here that the second invader comes right after the first one, only a few time steps later. But it would be interesting to see how time matters if we increase the time between the two invasion events. Is there any effect or not? What if the first is established and the other comes later?
Yeah,
It is a very good
exactly. So
question. So, and this study is about the almost simultaneous case, but it would be interesting to investigate the time effect.
yeah, I mean, my instinct would be just to maybe even look at the simplest thing of two sequential invasions. So the simultaneous and the infinitely far
Yeah.
uh, cases, just to see if that makes a difference. No, thanks. That was very helpful, and my apologies if in the meantime anyone has a question, please go ahead.
Uh, I am surprised that apparent competition has a synergistic effect, but the normal competition is not, despite it is called apparent competition because usually think that it is a similarly negative interaction between. So why it works here differently?
I mean that the effect of exploitative competition is not counterintuitive. It has the competition has a negative impact in terms of their own biomass change, but the apparent competition could have a positive invasive species by, for example, by if they share a common predator, then the predation pressure can ease, or the another invader can release the first one from that higher predation pressure. But it is important that we didn't investigated the effect of the surrounding community. So we don't know when they are in an apparent competition connection, but we don't know the other connection with the other resident species. The main focus was here only on the invaders themselves, but not the connection with the resident species, and that species can actually alter the magnitude of these effects.
Yeah, so obviously they don't. If one species don't able to increase the predator density that much because
Yeah, yes,
because
yeah,
other things are happening. Yes,
yeah.
I understand that.
Any other questions?
Another question that you had this metabolic mass rate. It was 100
Yes.
between two levels. It is not too much.
Uh, as far as far as I read the publications about this, it is an average difference. But as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, it's and this framework and this ratio applicable mainly for marine ecosystems. So it is very a good framework, but it is limited to that type of ecosystems. But this ratio it is a plausible ratio between that type of community.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So one thing I wondered a little bit is that the allometric trophic network model creates this link between lots of the parameters and the position within the trophic network.
Yes.
Is it, I mean, is it useful to just try and split apart those two parts, or is there a sense that like the potential success of an invasion is determined more by the core parameters of the invader, or is it, or how do you separate that from the trophic position that kind of flows from the body size?
I hope I understood you well.
Sorry, I wasn't the clearest, but
yes, it is a very good question whether, if I understood you well, whether the body size of the invader determined the success in advance previously. In our model here, in our simulations, it is a quite it has a biased effect that we determined the invader's body size based on its trophic level, which means that we so well. An invader with a proper body size is predestined for success. And it is a tricky thing here that despite this fact, in some trophic level, the success is less likely than other one. So yes, it is a good question whether it is a bias or not. But the effect of trophic level is so strong in terms of invasion success that we decided to allow this predestination here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions? While people are thinking, just wanted to ask something because you mentioned that the model is very, very stable.
Yes.
Is that because of self-regulation? Is that because of high type functional responses, or both, or what is it that?
Yeah, I think both of them. We used the high type of functional response, and I didn't mention, but the stability was so strong that all of the simulations resulted in a stable fixed point. So no chaos at all and no limit cycles, but a stable fixed point. It is very useful because if you want to compare the different stages or different states, it is very useful. It is a question whether it is realistic as well, but
I guess one question that comes to mind is that if you use the type 3 functional response, that essentially assumes self-regulation out of the box, right? In that if you want to generalize a type 3 response to multiple prey species.
We don't use the type 3, but the intermediate,
the Hill exponent is something in between. I guess the same thing counts, though, that unless that exponent is exactly 1, you have these responses that are not exactly additive.
Yeah.
So that the meaning that the what I like to call the ribbon test is broken, or label invariance is broken, right? That if you take a species, a prey species, and artificially split it in 2, tie blue ribbons on one half, red ribbons on the other, count as if they were 2 different things, and add up the response, it should be the same as if the species were the same, which the type 3 or type 2 point some
Yeah, 2 point, yeah.
response doesn't do, which makes sense because what the response assumes is that the reason why you have the sigmoid shape is that at low prey frequencies you have some hiding place, and that makes it
Yeah,
difficult for the predator to find the prey. And essentially what we're assuming is that each prey has its own.
yeah,
And that's what in effect adds an extra self-regulation. Why am I going on about this? Is because is it actually meaningful to turn off explicit self-regulation altogether and just rely on the type 2.0, 2 point epsilon response to generate stability?
yes, it would be interesting to try it. I
I'm not
think,
sure if it would. Yeah. Anyway, it might be worth a try just to see if
yeah.
it still produces fixed point stable communities.
I was happy with this fixed point.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you. Other questions? Maybe I'll just throw in one more. Sorry, how were the invaders generated compared to the residents?
Sorry, repeat it, please.
Sorry, how were the invaders generated compared to
Yeah,
residents?
yeah. The invaders were completely the similar way. There was we generated the resident network, and after that we extended the adjacency matrix and we put into the invaders.
So
But
is the way it works is that you essentially generate random biomasses,
yes, not random.
or
It
body
was
masses, I
yeah.
should say.
So okay, I understand. So the invaders started at lower biomass, but not very low biomasses, but not in the range of the resident biomass, uh, so that we could avoid the propagal pressure effect.
Yeah, but I misspoke. I didn't mean biomass. Sorry, I meant
Yeah,
body mass.
yeah, body mass.
So did you generate the both the invaders and residents by taking some interval of possible body masses and just drawing randomly?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay,
yeah.
okay. Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Thank you. Other questions? There are no more questions, then thank you again, Agi, for the interesting
Thank you
talk
very
and
much for
discussion.
inviting
Of
and for
course.
listening to me.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll be back with news in the next year with more seminars. And I promise that I'm going to update my Zoom right now. That's not something I'm going to delay anymore. Apologies for the technical mishaps. Otherwise, hope to see you the next year. And until then, have a good rest of your day and year. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello.
Bye.